beta in just a few short weeks. So it'll be ready to try out. And in fact, you can already start trying it out already. And if you go to aurelia.io, the homepage for this framework, you'll see a brief description, which is Aurelia is a next-gen JavaScript client framework for mobile, desktop, and web that leverages simple conventions to empower your creativity. I just want to break a few of those statements down. It's next generation, so the code that we write to write an application with Aurelia is actually based on ECMAScript 2016, which is the next coming specification that adds even more interesting things to the JavaScript language. Things like decorators, which you can think of as annotations or attributes if you're a .NET C# developer. It also has integration with web components, and it's very forward-looking and taking a look at everything that's coming down the pipe from the W3C and the ECMAScript specification. And I think that's pretty exciting. It is a framework, so it's not a library that you load onto the page and you make calls into it. Instead, you load the framework onto the page, and then you write code that the framework calls into. And the framework will look for specific pieces of your application because you've named things appropriately and put things in the appropriate directory. And when it comes time to render something on the page, it will call into the code that you've written, and you'll retrieve data from your web server or something like that and put it into a view model, and poof, Aurelia will handle everything else and get things onto the screen and do data binding. It does require, there's no other dependencies. Aurelia doesn't have any dependencies. You don't have to use Bootstrap or jQuery or anything else. It does have a few polyfills that it often requires because it's trying to use advanced features or early features of things that are still being defined, so sometimes you have to polyfill features in the browser to make sure that everything's going to work, but that all just happens seamlessly. Aurelia targets mobile, desktop, and web, so originally when Aurelia was being authored, we were really just targeting the latest evergreen browsers, so the latest Chrome and the latest Firefox and the latest IE. But since the early days, people have written some polyfills and actually gotten this to work all the way back to IE9, which is amazing, actually, considering how bad IE9 can be. And simple conventions. When it mentions simple conventions, what I really enjoy about Aurelia is I feel pretty productive with this framework because I can write a simple view model and a simple view, and I don't have to worry about registering anything or configuring anything. If I just name things appropriately, put them in the right location, all the magic happens. And if there's any conventions that Aurelia has that I don't like, it's pretty extensible, and I can go in and I can plug in custom view model locators and custom observer strategies. It's very flexible that way. So with that in mind, how would you get started developing with Aurelia? The first thing you would need to do is get Node.js installed on your machine. So it's not that Aurelia depends on Node, and you certainly don't need to have Node on a production server. But if you're doing software development with all of the latest JavaScript features, all of the best tools for JavaScript come through Node.js these days. So we're going to need things like JavaScript package managers. We're going to need things like JavaScript transpilers that will take JavaScript code that is written for ECMAScript 2016, which no browser implements many of these features yet. We need to take that and transpile it into ECMAScript 5 code, which runs in pretty much every browser. And we'll do that with tools that come ultimately executing under Node.js. So you would have to install Node. You would have to install a command line Git client, ideally. And once you do that, you can use Node to install a package manager known as JSPM. JSPM is an interesting package manager. So if you're familiar with NuGet or Bower or NPM, those are all package managers. And the ultimate goal of a package manager is I want to say, package manager, install something. And it'll download all the source code that I need, or binaries if we're in NuGet, and put them in the right location. JSPM does that. I'll show you from the command line here in just a second. I can say JSPM install Aurelia framework, and it'll bring down all the Aurelia pieces that I need, as well as all of the Aurelia framework dependencies, and lay them out on my file system somewhere. But JSPM goes far beyond that, and it's really quite interesting. In this new world of JavaScript, we're dealing with this module syntax, which we'll see here in just a bit, where inside of a JavaScript file, I can say something like, I want to import this abstraction, this class, or this thing from the Aurelia framework. Please bring that and make that available to me inside of this file. And there has to be APIs and a software available at runtime that knows where the Aurelia framework lives and how to bring that off the file server and get it into the browser and put things in place. So what JSPM actually does when you install JavaScript libraries and frameworks is it not only lays out the code, the JavaScript files that you need on the file system, it also maintains a configuration file that gets loaded into the browser and a module loader that gets loaded into the browser that know where things are on your web server. So that when something says, I need to import this thing from the Aurelia framework, it knows where to go, how to formulate the URL to issue an HTTP GET request to get that thing from your web server and bring it down and make it available to you so you can start programming. So JSPM is much more than just a package manager. It lays down a configuration file and includes some shims, and it's basically a polyfill. I say here on the slide, a system API polyfill. So the story is that the ECMAScript specifications tell us what import and export and how modules should behave at a syntactic level in JavaScript, and that part is done and complete and works very well. But then you need this runtime support for modules, basically an API and pieces of software in the browser that understand those statements, and that part is still a little bit in flux. But we have polyfills available that you just load into the browser, and I can import modules using these polyfills. Again, all of this will be concrete in just a bit. The first thing you would do with JSPM, I realize that might not be quite visible on this, is you would go in and you would tell JSPM to initialize a configuration file for you. See if I can actually use a zooming tool. Apparently not. Let me sit down and try this. Oh, there we go. You would install JSPM via nodes npm. That would put JSPM on your computer. Then I can say things like JSPM init. And remember, it has to maintain a configuration about where things are going to live. When I say JSPM init, it's going to start adding things to a configuration file about where packages should live, where my public folder is, that is, where do I serve static assets from. This config.js we'll see is very important because config.js is where JSPM records information about where things are installed. And the only other piece I would like to point out is, do you wish to use an ES6 transpiler? And the answer is, well, for development, the answer is usually yes. The wonderful thing about all this technology, it just makes some things so seamless. I can write a JavaScript file using ECMAScript 2015 or 2016 syntax and serve it right off my web server, and it comes down to the browser. And the polyfills that JSPM puts in place for me can actually transpile that thing on the fly and convert it into code that the browser understands. Would you do that for production? Probably not. So there are gulp tasks that I can show you that can pre-compile everything and bundle everything together so you just ship one big ES5 file down to the browser. And after JSPM init, you would start using JSPM install. And if you're going to be working with Aurelia, there's probably 4 modules, 4 pieces that you would want to install to get started with. Aurelia Framework, which is the core framework that provides data binding and routing and templating. The Aurelia Bootstrapper, which knows how to start up an Aurelia app. And the Aurelia HTTP client, which knows how to communicate with the web server. Let's just jump into this. So, I have a couple different projects to show you. One that is already working is actually a public application on a GitHub repository. It's called the Aurelia Skeleton Navigation app. So you can git clone that repository on GitHub. There's some simple setup instructions. You have to do npm install and JSPM install, and everything should be working. And it works under Windows too, but it runs under Node. That just demonstrates some features of Aurelia. For example, two-way data binding, so I can input something here into the input, and the full name's being computed and updated when I do this. Yes, I went to leave. And routing, let's submit this. All right. Well, actually, that's a feature. That's a feature where, no, seriously. You know, you get in front of a room full of people, you forget what you're doing. If the user is making changes to a form and then they click something that would navigate away from that form, Aurelia has the concept of a screen life cycle where it can go and ask the current view, is it okay to switch away? And this current view can say, no, I have dirty data, so let's not allow the user to move away right now. But now that I save it, I should easily be able to come over to GitHub users and have something fantastic happen, or not. That's interesting. Well, child router works. I can come over here and we'll talk about routing and how you can have a router inside of a router inside of a router, and history, navigation, all that just works. But before we look at that app, let's actually look at building a little something from scratch. So this is a basic ASP.NET 5 application. If I run it, all I have is an index.html or a default.html file that just says loading, doesn't do anything else. And I'd like to get Aurelia initialized and running here. I have already done a JSPM init. I have already done a JSPM install to get Aurelia pieces in place. Now I just want to get this page running Aurelia to do something interesting. So traditionally, if you're using Angular, Ember, Durandal stuff, right, you just include that JS file on the page and start programming against it. With Aurelia, things are a little bit different because, again, we're working in this new world of JavaScript modules. So actually, the first thing I'm going to put in here is a script tag, script, whose source points to a software component that JSPM installs automatically. As soon as you start using JSPM in a project, JSPM just assumes that you're going to need things like system.js, which is, again, a polyfill for the browser that allows you to do import assets. So at this point, I can say things like system.import, bring me in some JavaScript library. And in order to know where to load things from, I'm going to have to bring in that configuration file that JSPM maintains. It's right inside of www.root. We'll take a look at it here in just a little bit, what's inside of there. But that's basically information about where does stuff live on the web server. If I ask for something from the Aurelia router, what JS file do I have to make sure is present for that to work? And then the last thing I'm going to do is actually write a script that says, dear system, please import the Aurelia Bootstrapper, which is one component of Aurelia which knows how to spin up an application. And what it will do is look for an attribute that I have inside of my HTML somewhere, Aurelia-app, and assume that it's supposed to start the application inside of that element, wherever that attribute appears. So at this point, if I just run this application, or if I save everything and come back out to a browser and I have the developer tools open, I'm going to do a refresh, and hopefully we'll get an error, which we do. And the error, as I make you nauseous from all the zooming and scrolling around, hopefully that's large enough so you can see it from Germany, is Aurelia. This is just one of the conventions. When Aurelia starts up, it assumes that you're going to have some top-level view model or some top-level component called app.js. So it just goes off looking for app.js. I don't have an app.js yet. I'm going to write that. But that's one of the conventions. I don't have to tell Aurelia anything special to do that. So inside of www.root, which in ASP.NET 5 is where you serve static assets from. Let me create a new JavaScript file. I'll call it app.js. And what I want to do is export a class. I can pretty much call the class anything that I want. And this is ES 2015 syntax. I can give that class a constructor, and I could initialize some data in here. Say something like this.message equals hello from Aurelia. And I want to get this on the screen, but before I do anything to get it onto the screen, a couple observations. One is, it's really tough to write some of this JavaScript code in Visual Studio right now. it understands ECMAScript 2015 syntax, but not necessarily ECMAScript 2016 syntax. So it's quite often that I find myself flipping between two editors during the day, Visual Studio with for Sharp or for C# code, and then Atom or Visual Studio Code or something else for the JavaScript code. I'm going to try to stick to just Visual Studio today, but you'll see strange squigglies that'll say this is an error, that is an error. Let's just see what happens when I refresh now. Aurelia is going to come back and say, I'm not going to zoom in this time, but the error message is there was a 404 trying to find app.html. So basically throughout Aurelia, you always have this concept of pairing up a view model with a view. And they always just have the same name. So if I have something called movie.js, that could be a view model for movie.html. And Aurelia just always matches them up. And the beauty of the system is it doesn't matter if I'm building a screen or a page or a custom element. It all uses that same convention and the same model. So it's very simple. I never have to register anything or explicitly tell Aurelia about any of this. But let me go in and add an HTML file called app.html. And inside of here, I'm going to use a template tag, and I'm going to have an h1 that says hello. And then I'm going to assume that this is bound to my view model, which was app.js, and I just need to remember what I called this field, message. So inside of here, I could say, let's have a div that displays my message. So that's the syntax to data bind against the view model. And I should be able to flip over into the browser now and hopefully execute this page without any errors. And there we go. We got that. Let's try one more thing. Just to show you the two-way data binding, let's have an input type equals text and value.bind. Essentially, when you're working with Aurelia, anytime you see an attribute that does dot something, that's the Aurelia binding system is going to kick in and do something special with that. And I could say value.please bind this against the message field of the current view model and refresh this page. And now I should be able to come in here and type stuff and submit it to the server and save it, right? Very simple. Making any sense? Okay, good. I like making some sense. One thing to notice, I'll just get this out of the way now. You might have noticed it took a little bit of time for that page to load. And if we looked really closely at the Chrome developer tools, we would see that in order for this page to finish, it took 261 requests. And you're probably thinking, gee, that's a large number of requests for such a simple application. But, and you'd be correct. So the story is that when you start writing ECMAScript 2015 code and breaking things down into modules, you have a tendency to spread things across a lot more files and have a single abstraction per file. And that componentizes things, and you can hide things inside of a file now. It's all very wonderful. There is a bundler that Aurelia provides where you can bundle everything that is needed to make this application run into a single file that's already been transpiled. So you can cut the number of requests down to, it's going to be 10 or 12, one for your root HTML file and one for Twitter Bootstrap and so forth. So what I'm doing right now is just letting things run naturally. There's no bundling as yet. So that's why there's so many requests, and that's why it can take, a couple seconds for this application to actually spin up. All right, so that's bootstrapping an app. You bring in system.js, you add config.js, you tell the Aurelia Bootstrapper to get started, and you'll be off and running. And the whole, as I said before, the conventions throughout Aurelia is that you put a view model, some .js file, together with a view, which is a .html file, and then you can use binding expressions to move data between the two. And what's happening right now is that when I say something like system.import Aurelia Bootstrapper, that system API, which was provided by a module loader, inside of system.js, looks inside of config.js, the data structure that it created, and says, where do I find Aurelia Bootstrapper? So let's just take a quick peek at config.js, just because I like to demystify some of the magic that is happening behind the scenes. If you look inside of config.js, this basically has some information about transpilation options. And then here's my map. This would tell the system API, when someone needs something from Aurelia Bootstrapper, you need to go to the location where the GitHub files are stored on the server and ask for Aurelia/Bootstrapper and then a version number. And it can use that information and combine it with this information to say, oh, I need to make an HTTP request to JSPM packages/GitHub/Aurelia/Bootstrapper. And we would be able to find that Bootstrapper folder inside of here. Again, might be a little bit small, but it is over here. Now I don't know how to scroll over. Ugh. Screw this whole zooming thing. It's terrible. So anyway, system will bring in Aurelia Bootstrapper. Aurelia Bootstrapper starts to run and says, hey, the first thing I do by convention is ask for the app module. So it goes to the system API and says system.import app. And we go off and looking for the app.js file that I just wrote. And then Aurelia says, the module loader actually says, when we get back that back from the web server, oh, this is not ECMAScript 5 code. It starts with an export statement. Therefore, I must transpile it. And when I JSPM initialized this project, I picked a transpiler for this project of Babel, which I think is pretty good. Babel can take ECMAScript 2015 code or 2016 code and convert it into ECMAScript 5 code. And right now we're doing that on the fly in the browser, but you can also do that during a build step using a gulp task or a grunt task, whatever you like. And you can write Aurelia code actually using ECMAScript 5 code if you want to. I prefer the newer syntax. And you can write Aurelia code using TypeScript if you're a fan of TypeScript. There's TSD files out there for Aurelia. So once Aurelia gets app.js and it gets app.html, binds them together, runs its templating engine over the HTML, figures out what the expressions are inside, and we're up and running. So let's take this a little further. What if I wanted more control over my environment? Right now I'm just telling Aurelia, hey, load up the Bootstrapper and get running. What if I wanted to configure logging, or I wanted to configure some additional plugins? I wanted to configure the IOC container because Aurelia does have a dependency injection system. Or I wanted to include the event aggregator because Aurelia has an event aggregator module and I wanted it to do something special, configure it at the start. That's where inside of my Aurelia app attribute, I can actually specify a specific module to load. So now I no longer want to start with app.js. I want it to load up something called main.js, and then main.js will tell Aurelia what to do next. So now Aurelia would go out, and this is what main.js could look like. I could export a function from that module that Aurelia will invoke and pass itself into, and that allows me to configure the framework however I want. So this is some pretty standard configuration when I invoke standard configuration and add some additional logging statements, and then tell Aurelia to start, which returns a promise. So everything asynchronous is modeled with a promise in this new world. So then, after Aurelia has started, I tell Aurelia, let's set the root of the application using the app module and use document.body. So take the app module and put it where document.body is inside of there and bind things together for me. So that's a little more explicit control. There is dependency injection with Aurelia, and this is what it looks like. And actually, I think I'm going to do this. Let me show you. Let's do a couple things here, actually. I have an API available in this website. So if I go to this website and go to /API/movies, I can get back some movies in JSON format. Let's just see if I can get those real quick with Aurelia and get them onto the page. So inside of Visual Studio, let's come back to app.js. And the way dependency injection works is it's a very easy to work with container. And there's several ways to do this, but I'm going to import from Aurelia framework a decorator known as inject. Because with inject, basically I can provide the metadata to the IOC container about what it needs to pass in when it invokes this constructor. Because what I want to do is use something that'll talk HTTP to my web server. And of course, in production, I actually wanted to talk over HTTP, but in test or development, I might want to pass in what's the word? A stub or a fake or a mock. Just a slight bit of jet lag. I'm going to lose a couple words today. That would be the HTTP client from Aurelia HTTP client. And by default, unless I can configure the container to behave differently, if I tell it to inject this type of object, it's just going to instantiate that thing and pass it in. But I can always override that inside of the other configuration. So I will get an HTTP thing here, and I will save that off and say this.http equals whatever you gave me to talk HTTP. There's a screen activation lifecycle. So if I want to talk over HTTP and I want to get that movie data before Aurelia actually puts something on the screen, I can write an activate function, which is just called by convention, and I could say, let's return the promise when I invoke HTTP and I call get something from /API/movies. And when that will return a promise. When that returns, it will give me back an object that represents the HTTP response. And what I want to do is say this.movies equals response.content. That will be automatically, the JSON response will be automatically deserialized for me and put into this content field. And I think I'm syntactically correct here. I have lots of warning messages from Visual Studio, but I've learned to ignore those over the years. I'm just going to double check that against the slide real quick. Import inject, import HTTP client. Yeah, what could go wrong? We'll try it. Save everything. Refresh the page. And of course, I'll have to change the template around to actually display movie information. I haven't done that yet. Just wanted to see if I get an error here. Seems good. I think that request actually went off. So let's change our template around to display movie information. That would be app.html. Now what I want is a template that has a table inside that has, this is exciting, right? Watching someone type out HTML. Title of the movie and the length of the movie. Make this simple. Now what I want is a table row that will repeat. And you can, this is a custom Aurelia attribute that says, oh, you basically want to write a for of loop in JavaScript. For movie of movies, I want to write out the movie title. Movie basically becomes you can think of it as a local variable now inside of this DOM section. And the movie.length. Let's save that file, cross our fingers, and pray to some deity that it works. Yeah, good. It's ugly, but we got data from the server. We put it on the screen. So hopefully this is giving you an idea of how Aurelia works. And at this point, I need to accelerate things just a bit so we can get through some slides. That's how you could work with the HTTP client from Aurelia. It provides that as a separate module that you can use. Again, with the dependency injection system, it's really easy to take the built-in HTTP client and wrap it with something that knows how to cache or so forth. How would you create a service? I mean, this is what I love about Aurelia and this version of JavaScript. Let's say I wanted to take that HTTP call and not do it directly from a view model. I want to encapsulate it inside of some component that understands how to retrieve movie data and update movie data. I'm just going to write a class. I'm just going to export a class and inject HTTP into that class instead. And now from a view model, I could just import this class and call .getAllMovies. And I don't have to worry about URLs and what sort of response format, it comes back in. Really easy to use. Templating is interesting. What I haven't shown you is that this uses the HTML import technology, which is quite smart about taking a hunk of HTML and understanding the other assets that are inside of there, like other CSS links and images and so forth. I could actually write a template that has a link to a new style sheet, and that the templating system in Aurelia will make sure that CSS file gets included in the DOM at the appropriate location. Data binding is all about using things like value.bind or href.bind to say I want to use something off of my view model to figure out what value should go here. So value.bind would be binding against a first name property of my view model, and there's a URL property in my view model. Aurelia is pretty smart. When it sets up the binding for an input, it assumes you're going to want two-way data binding so that if the value in the DOM element changes, that value is pushed back into your view model. But if you bind something against an href, that's going to be a one-way binding, because if we don't expect an href to dynamically change, and we don't need to push that back into the view model. But you can be explicit and say, I want to do dot one-way or dot two-way or dot one-time binding to get something onto the screen. And it's an adaptive binding system. So long story short, when Aurelia has to figure out how am I going to bind to this thing, it uses an observer locator, which finds the appropriate object, the strategy to implement binding. So there's different things. We need different components to bind against DOM elements than we do against view model pieces, and different DOM elements, like the select element versus input type equals check, they require different observers. And Aurelia tries to be very efficient about how it observes changes on your view model. There's been a lot of talk over the years about how inefficient two-way data binding can be and how expensive it can be because there's a lot of dirty checking involved sometimes. Aurelia tries to be very smart and efficient, and if the browser supports something known as object.observe, which not a lot of browsers support just yet, Aurelia will use that, and that's a very efficient mechanism for detecting changes that happen inside of an object. But if you just have a regular field, like we have in our view model here with this.movies or this.message equals, Aurelia will use object-defined property to rewrite that property in a way that it can be observed efficiently. And if all else fails, if Aurelia has no other options, it can fall back to doing dirty checking on a specific property to know that, oh, you changed something in the view model, now I have to update something on the screen. You can help Aurelia sometimes with things like computed properties by adding an annotation that says, hey, this property is computed from these other two properties. So Aurelia is smart enough to know if something in those change, it can do stuff. What about handling events? I can use things like click.trigger or click.delegate. That's basically a way of, if you're familiar and remember jQuery stuff, you could trigger an event. That's a way of listening specifically on that DOM element. Whereas delegate is something that you could do at a higher level, like on a table tag element, and say, and you'd be able to capture click events on any of the elements that are inside of that table. Aurelia does have a router, so the way you would configure routing information will look something like this. Basically on your app view model, if you have a method called configure router, Aurelia will find that and invoke the method and pass in the objects that you need to program against to tell the router how things should behave. And this is basically saying, I have a route where if the user is at the root of my page or is at /list, load up this view model, app/list. So that means, we'll go out and look in the app folder for a list.js and a list.html file, load those two things in, bind them together, put them on the page. This one is a parameterized URL, so if the user is at /detail/3, then Aurelia understands it needs to load up the details module. And in the activate module for the details module, you can receive the parameters that were gleaned out of the URL. So you could ask for the parameters and see that ID is equal to 3, whatever was in the URL. The information inside of the router is bindable. So that nav true property is a way of saying, this is actually something that I want to appear in my navigation menu. And then you can basically write a repeat.for over the bindable routing rows that are in this routing configuration and write out menu items that say, oh yeah, this is the home, link for home, and the link for about. That's very nice. And every view model that you write, you can override or provide one of these 4 methods: can activate, activate, can deactivate, or deactivate. Pretend that's a lowercase d, since JavaScript is case sensitive. And that's your way of communicating with the router and saying, yes, I can activate. Now I'm activating, but you have to wait a second because I'm fetching data from the server, so don't put me into the DOM just yet. Wait till I get the data. You could do that just by returning a promise from activate. And when someone tries to navigate away from you, you can implement a can deactivate method to say, no, user, we can't leave you just yet because the user has some dirty data. So you can also return a promise and prompt the user somehow and eventually tell the router that, no, the user wants to stay on this page. Child routers are rather amazing. So you can have a view model that gets loaded by the router, and that view model can have a configure router method that configures a child router. And now everything you do inside of that view model, all the navigation the user performs, is relative to the parent. And it's really quite interesting what you can do. This was the example I was showing you over here, where it's basically, when I go to the child router here, it loads another instance of that same view model, which configures another child router. So this is sort of like recursive child routing. But what's interesting about it is just how everything just works. And we maintain history, and I can hit the back button and slowly come out of my navigation. That can be quite useful. Yes, you can write custom elements with Aurelia. So this is an example of writing a navbar custom element on my own. That would be as simple as writing a navbar.html file and a navbar.js file. And one way to use navbar is to require it in my template. That's an explicit way of telling Aurelia, hey, I'm going to use this navbar as a custom element, so be aware of it. There's also a way, if you're going to do this a lot, to register a custom element during the startup of your application, so you would just be able to use navbar wherever you want without using that require. So you can definitely build custom elements. You can build custom attributes. So I just have a few minutes left. I will tell you, again, Aurelia is in a public preview right now, but the first beta will be shipping in just a few weeks. If you want to track this information, if you want to look at the documentation, if you want to follow the blog, go to aurelia.io. That's a good starting point. It'll give you all the GitHub links and the Get Started document. There's also a Gitter channel, so if you clone the repository and you start playing with Aurelia and you have any questions, if you go to gitter.am/Aurelia/discuss, there's always a ton of people on there answering questions, and sometimes it's really quick. I was just talking to someone yesterday who said, hey, I tried it out and I asked a question there, and Rob Eisenberg was on 2 seconds later and told me what I did wrong. That was pretty cool. If I don't get to talk to you today or take your question, feel free to email me. That's my email address, but I'm open for questions at this point. Yes?
So what about AngularJS?
What about it? Well,
Why should I pick Aurelia and start my project?
yeah, fair question. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that this new world is without friction. Aurelia and also Angular 2, to be honest, are going to require developers to learn new tool sets and new approaches to building applications using modules and things like that. I'm biased. I have a difficult time answering that question. I'll tell you, if you're happy with Angular, stick with Angular. Yeah, but look at things like this just to evaluate it. And we all know there's Angular 2 coming down the road, and maybe you look at Angular 2 and you say, I don't quite like the direction they're going, or I think, I have to write too much code for this to get things to work. That would be the way to look at it. Any questions not involving Angular? Yes. So, it's lunchtime, isn't it? That's a bit of a loaded question. There is more overhead in some things in this new world because you have these module loaders, and even when you do bundling, there's just certain things in the infrastructure that take a little longer because they're not native in the browser right now. Everything's polyfilled a lot. But the performance of Aurelia has steadily improved over the last 6 months, and it's something they're looking at really closely, and they're building a custom benchmarking app so that they can make Aurelia the absolute fastest framework that's out there. So I think by the time it releases, it's going to be in really good shape. And it always tries to do the most performant thing possible.
Can we see some kind of real projects in Aurelia already?
Real projects? Yeah, I mean, the thing is it's in a public preview, so not a lot of like big public projects are out there as yet. But email me and I can give you a link to some few things. Yes? Does it? Oh, how easy is it to unit test? It's very easy with the, if you follow the dependency injection stuff, you can always pass in stuff so that you're not tied to a specific networking component or things like that. So it's just as easy then as testing any other plain old JavaScript object.